The basin stretched out like a forgotten promise, dry, flat, and endless, the kind of land where silence doesn't just surround you, it settles into your bones. Eli Mercer had been riding since before the sun rose, boots firm in the stirrups, reins loose in one hand, the other always close to the rifle tied to his saddle. There wasn't any destination, just motion. He wasn't chasing anything, and he sure as hell wasn't being chased. He moved like a man who'd long ago stopped expecting to arrive anywhere. He didn't carry much, just what a man needed to keep moving. Bedroll, tin cup, jerky. No maps, no letters, no home. Just dust, wind, and the weight of old memories. The kind that don't fade, they just harden inside you. That's when he saw her. Just a flicker at first, movement in the brush that didn't match the rhythm of the wind. Eli stopped. He didn't call out. He didn't even speak. Years of fighting and bounty work had taught him. Anything that moved like that was either trying to ambush you or trying not to die. He stepped down, quiet, methodical, rifle in hand, boots crunching over dry soil like old bones snapping. When he parted the brush, he found her. She was half buried in the dirt. One leg twisted underneath her, blood crusted along her calf. She looked young but worn, like time had been rough with her. Her dress was torn, dirt caked, one moccasin missing. But her eyes didn't beg, they held. And then she said it. "Please don't shoot me," she rasped. And after a moment, quieter, emptier, "If you don't, I'll give you a child." She didn't say it like it meant anything. Not like a bargain, not like she was offering something sacred or even valuable. It was just what she had left. The last card in the hand that life had already folded. And I'll tell you, that line, it hit like nothing else would have. Not because it was shocking, but because it was hollow. Because you know someone only says something like that when the world's taking everything else from them. He could have walked away. Hell, maybe most men would have. It wasn't his fight. She wasn't his problem. And in a land like that, you learn real quick not to get tangled up in someone else's tragedy. It gets you killed. Or worse, it makes you feel again. But Eli didn't move. His heart didn't race. It clenched. He kept the rifle up. Not because he planned to use it, but because reflex is a hard thing to kill. Still, he crouched. Not close, just enough to reach into his coat and place a tin flask on the ground. Then he backed away 3 steps and waited. She stared. Her hands trembled, but her eyes never left his. After a while, she crawled toward the flask. Slow, painfully slow, like every inch she moved might cost her more than she had left. And when she drank, it wasn't desperate. It was methodical, just enough to survive. It's strange what makes two people start to trust each other. Sometimes it's not words, not even actions. Sometimes it's just not walking away. I've always believed that the desert has a way of stripping people down to what's true. It doesn't care about your stories, your regrets, or your reasons. Out there, there's no mask thick enough to survive the sun and wind. What you are is what shows. And Eli Mercer, he was tired. Not the kind of tired a night's rest can fix. Tired in the soul. But something in her, this woman half-starved, half-broken, and still sitting upright, something in her kept him from riding off. Maybe it was her silence. Maybe it was the way she didn't flinch when he lowered the rifle. Or maybe it was because deep down, he recognized something familiar. That look in her eyes, like she had already made peace with dying. You ever felt that? Looked at someone and saw your own ghost in their shadow? I don't know. Maybe that's all it takes sometimes. He didn't ask her name. Not yet. And she didn't offer it. But when he turned back to the horse and then looked over his shoulder just once, he gave the smallest nod. The kind that isn't a question, isn't a command, just an opening. She limped after him. And just like that, they weren't strangers anymore. Not quite companions, not yet, but not alone either. That was the first step. Not into romance, not into salvation, just out of being alone. And sometimes, that's how all the real stories start.
He didn't shoot her. That was the first thing. Not because he trusted her, and not because he knew what she'd been through, but because something in the way she sat there, still, not begging, not flinching, told him she'd already been through enough. Eli just didn't raise the rifle again. Instead, he reached into his coat, pulled out that dented old flask, and placed it on the ground between them. No words, no invitation, just water. Then he stood back, 3 paces, waiting. You know, there's a kind of silence that means danger, and another kind that just means survival. This was the second kind. She didn't rush for it, didn't lunge, just waited, measured, then crawled forward like her body had learned not to move fast anymore. She drank slow, like someone who'd had to ration hope. Eli watched her, but not like a man staring at prey. He wasn't trying to figure her out, not exactly. He just needed to see if she'd fall apart or hold together. She held. When she was done, she didn't say thank you, and he didn't expect it. Instead, he turned, walked back to the horse, and looked over his shoulder once. Not to check, but to offer. A small nod, just barely there. And she followed. Not because she trusted him, not yet, probably not even close, but because her feet didn't have another direction left in them. Maybe you felt that before, like you weren't choosing so much as surrendering to something that just felt slightly less dangerous than staying put. That night they made camp, not together, but not apart either. Eli built a small fire like he'd done 100 times before. Efficient, quiet, forgettable. The kind of fire that didn't draw attention. She stood back, arms crossed, leaning on one foot, watching him like a person who still expected to be hurt at any moment. He didn't speak, just set down a piece of jerky near the fire, then he sat down on the other side and stared into the flames. After a minute, she crept forward, grabbed the food, and ate it without a sound. It's strange how the smallest acts can build something solid. A drink of water, a shared meal, no sudden moves, no questions asked. I remember once camping in the Rockies alone after a storm, my boots soaked, hands shaking from cold. And a stranger, just a passing hiker, left a thermos of coffee beside my tent before moving on without a word. I never forgot that. It wasn't the coffee. It was the fact that he didn't ask my story. He didn't try to fix anything. He just gave something warm and let me be. That's what Eli did that night. Gave her space. Gave her warmth. Let her be. She didn't sleep near the fire. She curled up on the edge of its light, knees to her chest, arms wrapped around herself. Eli stretched out with his bedroll, head on his saddle, rifle close like always. He didn't sleep much. Never did. Especially not around people he didn't know. But that night his eyes kept drifting toward the shadows where she lay, just to check she was still breathing, still there. And hers never fully closed either. You can tell a lot about someone by how they sleep, or how they don't. When dawn broke, it wasn't with warmth. The desert always fools you like that. Beautiful in the morning, but bitter until noon. Eli stirred first, like clockwork, every muscle moving slow from years of wear. No dreams, just a flat return to motion. He stood, rebuilt the fire without saying a word. She watched from her corner of dirt and rock, still tense, still quiet, but something had shifted, a fraction. Trust doesn't arrive with fanfare. It sneaks in like the sun behind morning clouds, slow, hesitant, barely noticeable, until suddenly the day feels different. When he put a cup of warm mush near her without asking if she was hungry, and then turned his back to tend the saddle, she ate. Not like someone who felt safe, but like someone who, for the first time in a long time, wasn't sure if she needed to run. And that, my friend, is a beginning. Not a love story, not yet. Not a redemption tale or miracle reunion. Just two people who didn't owe each other anything, choosing, without words, to not be alone that day. Sometimes that's all it takes. Not kindness, not heroics, just not leaving.
There's a certain kind of silence that settles between two people when they stop pretending. Not the awkward kind, not even the peaceful kind. No, this silence, it's like the stillness after a storm, where nothing's really calm, just suspended. That's what it felt like when Ayesha finally spoke about her past. They'd been walking most of the day, moving slow to spare her injured ankle. Found a shaded cut between two ridges, a place quiet enough to rest, but tight enough to defend. Eli helped her down from the horse, offered her a strip of cloth, and told her he was going to bind it. "You don't talk, I won't either," he said. She nodded just barely. That was their agreement. But once the wrap was tied off, snug, but not cruel, she asked for water. And then, after a stretch of silence that felt longer than it really was, she told him. "Traitors, 3 of them, drunk. Got lazy by the river. I ran." She didn't cry. She didn't pause. She just said it straight. Like the truth had lost all weight because she'd carried it so long, it didn't feel heavy anymore. "They tried to chase me," she said, "but I lost them in the rocks." Eli kept his eyes on her ankle, didn't look up. He just nodded. "When?" "Days ago." It wasn't much, but it was more than nothing. You know, people think the past lives behind you, but it doesn't. It lives in your body, in the way your shoulders tense at certain sounds, and how your voice changes when someone gets too close, and how you measure silence. And Eli understood that. He understood it better than most. Later, as the sun dropped lower and shadows stretched long, she asked him, "What about you? What are you doing out here?" Eli didn't answer at first, just stirred the fire, watched the flame roll across dry twigs. "I'm not looking for anything," he said. "Just not ready to stop moving." She turned her face toward the horizon, jaw tight, the ink tattoo on her wrist half hidden under dirt and scarring. 3 lines. Tribe, family, spirit. Symbols that once meant everything. Now they looked like relics from a world she wasn't sure still wanted her. "You used to fight," she said. Eli let out a breath through his nose. "Yeah." "For who?" He didn't turn to face her. "Doesn't matter now." But it did, and she knew that, maybe not in words, but in the way he said it. Eli had fought for the Confederacy, not because he believed in it, but because boys from where he was didn't get to say no to the men with rifles and orders. He came back missing a few fingers and carrying a scar down his cheek that ran deeper than it looked. After the war, he drifted, took bounties for a while, tracked down killers and thieves, men like himself, if he was honest. Then one day, he looked at the poster in his hand and couldn't tell if he was hunting a stranger or chasing his own reflection. He gave it up. Gave up everything, really. Flags, sides, even his name didn't feel like it fit some days. What was left was instinct. Just moving forward. Not toward anything, just away. They didn't speak again for a long while after that, just sat by the fire, each on their own side of the space between them, staring at nothing, feeling everything. I've thought a lot about how people survive what they're not supposed to, how they keep walking after everything inside them has been torn up and scattered, and I think the truth is sometimes they don't. Not fully, they just figure out how to move with the damage. That's what Eli and Ayesha were doing. They weren't trying to be healed. They were just trying to be understood by someone who wouldn't flinch when the story turned dark. And I think maybe that's rarer than we like to admit. Later that night, while the fire burned low and the stars hung quiet above the canyon, she asked him softly, "Would you fight them if they came?" He didn't hesitate. "Yeah," he said. It wasn't a vow. It wasn't some noble declaration, just the truth. A fact. As steady as his hand on the rifle beside him. She didn't say thank you. He didn't expect her to. Some things, when spoken, don't need answers. They just need to be heard. And for the first time, maybe both of them believed they'd been.
Sometimes, trust doesn't come with a grand gesture or a sudden change of heart. Sometimes, it starts in the quiet, in the space between pain and the first breath that doesn't hurt so bad. That afternoon, Eli crouched down beside her again. She was leaned up against a rock wall, the same wall that had shaded them all morning. Her ankle had swollen, bruised deep along the bone, turning a kind of purple that made even a seasoned man wince. But she hadn't complained, not once. He didn't ask for permission. He just said, "Gonna bind it. You don't talk, I won't either." She gave a nod, barely more than a blink, and let him reach for her foot. And that, in itself, was a kind of miracle. Not the healing, not the bandaging, but the fact that she let him. Think about that for a second. How long would someone have to be on the run? How much would they have to lose before even a simple touch felt like surrender? I remember once helping a stray dog that had been limping outside my cabin for 2 nights. Wouldn't let me near it, wouldn't eat if I stood too close. Until one night, I just sat there on the porch, didn't move, didn't speak, let the food sit between us. And when he finally came close, it wasn't trust, it was exhaustion. But after that, something shifted. That's what this moment was. Ayasha didn't flinch when he wrapped the cloth. She just watched him, steady, still. Her jaw was tight, but not from fear, more like restraint, like she'd learned how not to react. He worked quietly, years of habit in his hands. Tight, but not cruel. Clean, direct, the way you do when pain is common and words are too expensive to waste. When he finished tying the wrap, she didn't say anything at first, just looked down at her ankle, then up at him. And that's when it happened. "My name's Ayasha," she said. It was soft, cracked from thirst, but it landed heavy, like she was setting down a weight she'd been carrying too long. He didn't look surprised. He just nodded once, met her gaze, and replied, "Eli." 2 names in the middle of nowhere. That's all it was. But in that kind of silence, that kind of land, names matter. They're not introductions. They're declarations. I still exist. I'm still human. Neither of them said more than that. And yet, in the hours that followed, they moved differently around each other. When he lit the fire that night, she didn't hover in the dark. She sat closer, just within the glow. When he handed her a tin cup with boiled water and corn mush, she didn't wait for him to look away. She reached for it while he was still holding it. Small things, little shifts. Not trust, not yet, but something warmer than fear and quieter than survival. They didn't ask questions, not about families, not about the people left behind, not about what came next. Sometimes the stories don't come because the memories are too loud. Sometimes silence is the only thing that feels safe. But their movements, their breath, the way they each looked up now and then just to check the other was still there, that was the beginning of something. And maybe you felt that too. That strange space when you've been alone so long that being around someone isn't comforting, just unfamiliar. But then, slowly, your body starts relaxing without asking your permission. And you realize you're not watching your own back anymore, because someone else just might be. That night, Ayasha sat with her legs tucked underneath her, wrapped in the blanket he'd left unfolded between them. Her eyes didn't dart as much. Her breathing was slower. She wasn't healed, but she wasn't running in her mind either. Eli lay back on his bedroll, hands behind his head, rifle nearby like always. But this time, he didn't glance at the horizon as much. His eyes drifted to her silhouette, to the way she held her hands near the fire. And when he finally closed his eyes, it wasn't from habit. It was because, for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was guarding against the person across from him. They didn't speak again until morning, and even then it was just practical things. The fire, the water, the trail. But something had changed. Not loudly, not obviously, just enough. Enough to keep walking side by side without suspicion. Enough to hand over food without waiting for the other to flinch. Enough to say a name, and hear one in return, and realize maybe this wasn't just another stop on a long road of leaving. Maybe, just maybe, they'd both stopped for a reason they didn't yet know how to name. And maybe that was enough, too.
It happened slowly, like most real things do, one small shift at a time. By the second night, Ayasha didn't just sit near the fire. She helped build it. Not because she owed him anything, not out of fear or obligation, but because something inside her had started to stir again. Something human, something like will. She moved stiffly, still favoring her injured ankle, but her hands were steady. She stacked the twigs the way he did, fed the kindling with the dry grass they'd gathered. When the flames caught and rose up from the pit, she didn't flinch from the heat. She just sat, watched, and let the light paint over the bruises on her arms and the dust in her hair. Later, Eli passed her a piece of jerky and a chunk of bread. Nothing much, but it was all they had. She took it without hesitation, ate quiet and clean, wiping her fingers on her dress, eyes low. Then she did something unexpected. She shifted in the firelight, pulled the torn collar of her dress just enough to reveal her shoulder. 3 small scars. Crude, uneven. Like someone had tried to brand her and, halfway through, decided it wasn't worth the trouble. "They did this," she said, her voice flat. "One for each time I tried to run." Eli didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His eyes didn't leave the scars, but they didn't linger either. He just acknowledged them. Like you might nod at a gravestone. Not because you could fix anything, but because you respected what was buried there. Then she looked at him, and for the first time, she told him about her sister. She was 8. Her name was Sky. Just the sound of that name cracked something in the air between them. Like the fire flickered a little lower, like the wind held still long enough to listen. "They killed her when they took me," Ayasha said. "I think they meant to scare me. They did." And there was no drama in her voice, no tremble, no bitterness. Just a hollow steadiness that somehow hurt more than if she'd been crying. I don't know if you've ever sat next to someone who's lost everything and still had enough courage left to say it out loud. But I have. And it changes you. Eli shifted slightly, reached for the canteen, handed it to her without looking. She drank, slow, measured sips, and passed it back. They sat like that for a while. The coyotes howled in the distance. The fire snapped softly. The world didn't offer any answers. Then she asked him something that clearly had been waiting in the back of her throat since the first night. "Why didn't you take me up on what I said that first day?" She wasn't angry. She wasn't ashamed. She just wanted to know. Eli didn't look at her right away. He stared at the flames, at the black edges of the brushwood as it cracked down into coal. "I ain't most men."
That was it. That's all he said. But somehow it was more than enough. And she didn't press further, because the way he said it didn't come from pride, it came from something quieter, something like conviction or grief, or both. I think there's something sacred in restraint, in choosing not to take what's offered when it's given from a place of survival, not trust. Eli had known that, maybe because he'd been taken before, in other ways, by war, by the machine of bounty hunting, by systems and men and choices he never really got to make. Maybe he saw in her what he'd never had in himself, a chance to do something different. As the fire settled into glowing orange and red, he leaned back, stretched out in the dirt, hands folded over his stomach, rifle close as always. But his eyes were softer now, not relaxed, but less braced. And before he drifted toward that half-sleep men like him call rest, he said it. Quiet, sure. If they come for you, I shoot first. He didn't say it like a soldier making a stand, not like a protector or a hero. He said it like a man who had made peace with the cost of caring for someone who didn't expect to be cared for. Like a man who understood the weight of a promise and still chose to carry it. She didn't thank him. He didn't need her to. But the next morning, when they broke camp and moved forward into more dust, more wind, more unknown, she walked a little closer. Not beside him, not touching, just closer.
It started with a track. A print in the dirt, faint but too fresh for Eli's liking. Moccasin sole, widespread, weight in the heel. Not hers. Not recent enough to be harmless. She saw it too. Didn't say much, just looked at him. Jaw tight, shoulders pulled inward like she already knew what it meant. They didn't argue. They didn't even speak. They just moved. Somewhere behind them, someone, or more likely several someones, had picked up her trail. Maybe it was the men who took her, maybe it was someone worse. But Eli had seen that kind of print before. He knew how long a man could follow another if he had the right reason, or no reason at all. So they rode, west, then cut north through the low ridges Eli remembered from bounty days. He wasn't leading them anywhere permanent. He just knew places where the land folded quiet and the wind didn't carry voices. Places where you could disappear for a while. There was a narrow pass between two canyon walls, jagged stone, barely wide enough for a horse. That's where they went. And when they reached the mouth of it, he stepped off the saddle and helped her down. She didn't fight his hand this time, didn't flinch. Just winced, bit her lip, and leaned into the moment long enough to steady herself. They made camp under a shelf of red rock that night. No fire, too risky. They ate cold meat and sat close to keep warm. Funny thing about fear, it gets quiet after a while. It doesn't go away, just finds a rhythm. And in that rhythm, you start to notice smaller things. Like how she didn't keep her back to the wall anymore, or how she'd begun sleeping with her head tilted toward the center of camp, not the edge. That night, for the first time, she lay down near the fire pit, even if it was just cold ash. She wrapped herself in the blanket he'd offered, without saying thank you, and pulled it up over her chin. Her eyes stayed open for a bit, watching the dark. But then, she blinked. And didn't open them again. It might not sound like much, but I'll tell you, there's something powerful in watching someone choose to sleep. I remember years ago, on a long drive through northern Texas, I stopped at a truck stop where an old woman was sitting at a bench with her eyes closed, a full purse in her lap. She wasn't sleeping hard, but she was resting. And the thing that struck me wasn't how tired she looked. It was the fact that she felt safe enough to close her eyes. You don't do that unless some part of you believes the world isn't hunting you that day. That's what I saw in Ayasha, in that canyon. Not peace exactly, but permission. Her own silent permission to rest, to let go, just a little. Eli didn't sleep much that night. He never did. He sat with his rifle laid across his knees, back to the canyon wall, listening to the wind thread through the rocks like it had somewhere to be. He looked over at her every so often. Her breathing was slow, steady. The blanket rose and fell with each breath. She didn't clutch it like a shield. She held it like something earned. And Eli, he stayed awake, not just for himself anymore. It wasn't obligation, not protection either. He wasn't guarding her. He was simply there. The way you're there when someone chooses to trust you, even when they haven't said it out loud. That's what was happening between them. It wasn't a romance, not yet. It wasn't rescue. It was survival, shared. And I think maybe that's rarer than love. To be two people not trying to fix each other, not asking for more than presence, just agreeing without words that you won't run, not tonight, not from each other. In the morning, she stirred before he did, sat up slow, rubbed her eyes. She looked toward the canyon, where the sky was beginning to turn that pale, dusty pink that always shows up just before the heat. She didn't ask where they were going next, and he didn't offer a plan. Because sometimes staying alive is plan enough. And when trust starts to grow, it doesn't shout. It sleeps beside you, silent and still, blanket pulled up, eyes closed, for the first time in a long while.
There was this old cabin, half-burned, leaning, forgotten, tucked near Elk Creek, where the basin meets the hills. They reached it just before dusk, after days of riding hard and sleeping cold. It wasn't much. Roof half gone, one wall collapsed. Smoke stains climbed the chimney like old shadows that refused to leave. But to them, it looked like shelter. And for two people who hadn't stopped moving in what felt like a lifetime, that meant everything. They didn't say it out loud, but something in both of them softened when they stepped inside, like they'd found a pause. Not a finish line, not a home, but a breath. Eli walked slow through the wreckage, boots scraping across blackened boards. There was a child's doll, melted and split in the corner, a rusted kettle tipped on its side, an old boot with no match left near the hearth. And Ayasha, she stood in the middle of it all, still as a ghost. She didn't cry, didn't speak, just stared like she was looking at what could have been, and maybe in some other life had been. Then, quietly, she knelt beside the doll, picked it up, not to keep it, not to mourn it, just to feel it. As if by holding something burned and broken, she was letting herself grieve what she hadn't dared touch before. They didn't sleep right away that night. Instead, they worked. Eli found an old beam, cut it from a dead tree nearby, propped it beneath the angled roof. Ayasha stacked stones along the edge of the wall to block the wind. Her limp was still there, but she moved with purpose, determined. Like if she could just build something, anything, it might hold her together too. I've seen that before. In friends who clean obsessively after loss, in strangers who take up woodworking after divorce. We try to fix things with our hands when our hearts don't know where to start. That's what they were doing. By sunset, the place was still half ruined, but it stood. Inside, they lit a small fire in the old hearth. Smoke rose clean through the chimney. And that feeling, the one that had followed them for miles, that constant sense of being hunted, it didn't disappear, but it loosened. Later, while the coals burned low, they sat. I burned it when my mother died. There was nothing to stay for. She didn't say anything right away, just nodded slowly, like she understood, because she did. Then she spoke.
I had a place, a long house west of the mountains, warm, loud, always food cooking. She paused. I miss it. There was no bitterness in her voice, just distance, like she wasn't sure if the place she remembered had ever really existed, or if her mind had softened the edges to make it survivable. After dinner, just jerky and cornmeal mash, Ayesha pulled something small from the bottom of her pack, a bundle, wrapped in worn cloth. She opened it carefully, like it was fragile, like it still breathed. Inside was a pendant, obsidian, shaped like a feather, jagged on the edge, tied with sinew. She made this, my sister, before they took us. She didn't have to say her name again, Sky. Eli remembered. I wore it every day, until one of them tore it off. I found it later, in a pile of rags after I escaped. She handed it to him. He didn't say anything, just turned it over in his fingers. The obsidian caught the firelight like water trapped in stone, sharp, black, silent. Then he handed it back. She didn't cry, just nodded, rewrapped it, and tucked it away like it was part of her body. And you know, there's something holy about that kind of exchange. No vows, no promises, just a man holding a piece of someone else's grief and returning it without damage. That night, when they lay down beside the hearth, the blanket was wide enough to share. She moved closer, not clinging, not asking, just enough that their shoulders brushed. And for the first time since they'd met, they didn't ask what came next. Because maybe it didn't matter. Maybe, for one night at least, they had already arrived.
They were sitting near the fire when she said it. No warning, no build-up, just one of those quiet confessions that lands harder than a shout ever could. I think I'm done, Ayesha said, with running. She didn't say it like she needed him to agree. She just needed to hear it out loud, needed to say it for herself. The wind rustled through the grass around them, slow and dry, the kind of wind that didn't push, just passed. Overhead, the stars blinked clean between the branches, and Eli looked at her, not surprised, not confused, just listening. Because when someone tells you they're done running, they're not talking about footsteps. They're talking about the weight they've carried so long, they forgot what it felt like to stand still. He didn't ask if she was sure. He didn't ask why. He just nodded, looked into the fire a while longer, then said, "There's a place, northwest, 3 days from here, up in the shallow hills." He paused, like he could already see it. Old hunting camp, abandoned. Little barn, half collapsed. Ground's good. Water's close. Nobody goes that far unless they're looking for nothing. Ayesha didn't answer right away. She was quiet, turning the words over in her head, not to weigh their safety, but to ask herself if she believed she deserved a place like that. If staying still was something she had the right to want. And maybe you've been there too, that moment where you realize you're allowed to stop surviving, that it's okay to want more than just getting through the day, that you don't have to apologize for being tired. She looked over at him, this man who'd once lived his life on horseback in silence, and she said nothing. Just reached out, rested her hand on his arm. That was her answer. So the next morning, they didn't rush. They packed slowly, deliberately, not with panic, not with urgency, but with purpose. Ayesha cinched her own bags. Eli saddled the horse and checked the cinch twice, out of habit more than fear. The sun was just beginning to rise when they left the canyon behind and turned toward the hills. And for the first time since they'd met, they weren't leaving because they had to. They were going somewhere,
because they chose to. That's a powerful shift, isn't it? From flight to direction, from escape to arrival. Most people never realize how different those things feel until they've lived both, until they've been forced to move for so long they forgot what it felt like to stand still. I remember years ago, after a rough breakup, I spent 6 months driving, nowhere in particular, motel to motel, backseat naps, no address, no plan, just motion. And one night I remember pulling into a town with a single streetlight and a closed diner. I didn't have a reason to stop, but I did. And for some reason, I slept better in that town than I had in weeks. Because I wasn't running anymore. I was choosing to rest. That's what Eli and Aisha were doing now. They didn't know what they'd find up there in those hills. The barn might be worse than he remembered. The ground might be dry. But it didn't matter. Because this wasn't about the place. It was about what the place meant. It meant they could stop counting days since the last danger. It meant they could build a fire not just to warm themselves, but to stay, to cook, to sleep and wake in the same spot twice. It meant they weren't just traveling together, they were starting something. Maybe not a life, not yet, but at least a page that didn't begin with fear. They rode side by side through the tall grass, past brush and crows and stretches of land that didn't seem to belong to anyone. And as they went, the space between them shrank, not physically, but in rhythm. Their silences matched, their pace matched. They didn't need to look at each other to know the other was still there. And somewhere along that trail, just before the hills came into view, Aisha looked ahead and said, "We're really going, huh?" Eli didn't smile, but there was something easier in the way he spoke. "Yeah," he said, "we are." And this time, it wasn't about getting away, it was about staying, together, by choice.
The hills around the camp had gone green. Not the thick, loud green of the coast, or the kind you see after spring rains. No, this was subtle. Dusty sagebrush, wild rye swaying under the wind, a few stubborn flowers pushing up through old rock. But still, it was green, and it felt like life. They'd been there for weeks now, long enough that time no longer meant distance, long enough that days began to feel less like survival and more like living. In the mornings, Eli would chop wood, repair fence rails, check the traps down by the creek, and Aisha, well, she'd started asking to learn. It began with her watching him shoot, silent, careful, observing like a hawk. Then one day she said, "Show me." So he handed her the rifle, not like a teacher, like a partner, like he knew she already understood the weight of what she was holding. They started with still targets, old cans lined up on a stump. Her first shot rang wide, second clipped the edge, but by the fifth, she was dead on. "I used to be afraid of the sound," she admitted, wiping her brow with her sleeve. "I was afraid of what I'd become holding one," he said. Funny, isn't it, how the very thing that once made you feel like a monster can become the same thing that makes you feel safe when it's placed in the right hands for the right reasons. In return, she showed him how to patch a roof the old tribal way, woven branches beneath clay packed tight to keep the heat in. He watched her work, nimble fingers and sure footing, even on a tilted beam. They laughed when a pile of dirt collapsed right onto his boots. Not the nervous laughter of people trying to distract themselves, but real, belly-deep laughter, the kind that surprises you because you forgot it could live in your chest at all. One evening, as the sun slipped low, painting the hills in that soft amber light that makes everything look a little kinder, she asked him, "Why haven't you left?" They were sitting on the steps of the rebuilt porch, her hair tucked behind one ear, his hands dusty from mending a gate. He didn't look at her when he answered, just kept watching the wind ripple through the rye. "Because I don't want to pass you by," he said. She didn't reply, not with words anyway, but she leaned into him just enough that their shoulders touched,
and neither of them moved away. That kind of moment doesn't need a script. I think sometimes we confuse love with fireworks and music swelling at the right time, but in truth, love sounds a lot more like shared silence on a wooden porch, like choosing to stay put because someone else is there, breathing the same air. That night, they sat by the fire longer than usual. The wind had calmed, and the sky was full of stars, more than you could name, more than you could count. The kind of night that makes the world feel enormous, and still somehow yours. He handed her a mug of tea, chamomile, from the little patch she had started behind the barn, and after a long sip he said it. Just like that. "I'm yours." Not loud, not poetic, just certain. Like he'd tried on every other name in this world, and none of them fit. Not soldier, not bounty man, not loner or ghost, until now. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She reached across the firelight and rested her hand over his, and for a long moment, neither of them looked away. I remember once a friend of mine told me, "You don't know peace until you've seen someone choose to stay when they could have walked away." I didn't understand it back then, thought peace was something you earned alone. But watching Eli and Ayasha in that cabin, in those quiet hills, I finally understood. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. They'd made it. Not to safety, but to each other.
They reached it near dusk, just as the sun folded behind the ridge and the land turned soft with shadows. The old camp was still there, tucked into a bend of the hill where the trees broke and the creek ran slow and clear, half buried in dirt and time, but not forgotten. Not by Eli. He swung down from the saddle, took a long look around, then turned to her. Ayasha didn't ask if it would be safe, didn't ask how long they could stay. She just nodded, stepped forward, and started clearing the brush from the doorframe like it already belonged to her. That's how you know someone's ready, not when they speak it, but when they act like it's true. Eli patched the roof first, hands rough, quiet, moving slow but sure. She dug the trench behind the cabin, clearing space for runoff. Bare hands, dust on her cheeks, sweat at her brow. Neither of them said much, but the work, they did it together. There's something healing about shared labor, about building something side by side, not because you're paid to, not because you're ordered to, but because both of you want the same stillness at the end of the day. And maybe that's the thing about love no one tells you. It's not loud. It's not always words. Sometimes it's just digging a drainage ditch while someone fixes a broken beam and knowing that the life you're building is one you both chose. Later that night, sitting beside the fire pit they'd cleared of weeds and ash, Ayasha looked into the flames and said it, not like a confession, but like a truth that had finally found its voice. "I'm done," she said, "not just with running. I'm done with shrinking, with making myself small enough to disappear." Eli didn't speak right away. He just watched her. The firelight caught her face in a way that made her look like herself again. Not a version of someone escaping, but someone finally returning. He reached into his coat, pulled out a hand-drawn map, just charcoal lines on old hide, pointed to a spot a little west of where they were. "There's land here," he said. "Flat, good for growing, creek runs long, no roads nearby, nobody out there but the birds and the sky." He didn't say we could build there. He didn't say we could start over. He just offered it like a possibility, a door left open. And she didn't answer with words. She reached across, slow and steady, and laid her hand over his. That was her yes. I don't know if you've ever seen someone agree to stay, not because they were tired, not because they had no choice, but because they'd finally found something worth staying for. But I have. And it's quieter than you'd think. Quieter and heavier. Because staying, really staying, means choosing to face everything you've run from. To stop counting exits and start planting roots. They didn't talk about forever, didn't draw up plans. That's not how people like them worked. Forever wasn't something you said out loud, it was something you lived one quiet day at a time. That night, as the stars stretched overhead and the wind died down to a hush, they lay beside the fire in silence, not listening for footsteps, not bracing for dawn, just still. And you know, after all the miles and the fear and the dust, they weren't just surviving anymore. They were living. Not for escape, not for revenge, but for each other. And maybe, in a world that rarely offers peace to people like them, that's the closest thing to a happy ending you can ask for.